So thanks everyone for coming along this afternoon. As I said, this is our second session for Designwatch. You can actually check out some of yourself on the Designwatch website. Otherwise, keep coming along to our sessions as they unroll over the next few weeks. This one, Designwatch session number 2, is going to look at 4 key elements that are off that website. So some things that I think hopefully that you'll learn from and understand, I suppose, a little bit about how we think that the creation has been designed by an intelligent designer who we know is God. So you might remember from last week, Adam was up here and he was talking about some of the things like technology, and he was talking about how some of those things have obviously been designed by a person, a human, to make happen. What we are now going to start looking at is nature and say, how are some of those sorts of things seen in nature? Where did man get some of those ideas from? So, if you look at the world and life around us, you have to come to one of 2 conclusions: that life began by chance and that it evolved from there, or you would have to say that it was created by God. Sorry, just got to actually keep up with my little clicker because it's running from down there, not up here. But to think that it's been created by God and that it's sustained by God. So there's 2 choices, and let's go have a little bit of a look at those 2 particular choices. If life began by chance and then evolved, what we're talking about is evolutionary theory. And so it uses science as the basis for trying to confirm what is a theory. And it's called a theory because it is just that, it's a theory. Science tries to use data and measurements to come to a particular conclusion, but those sorts of measurements can be very sporadic and not necessarily tell the whole picture. So for evolutionists, there still needs to be a point where science can prove something. It might prove little pieces, but it doesn't tell the whole picture. What we don't have is interim species. So species have evolved over time. We don't have all these skeletons and fossils or living beings that are halfway points, or even quarter or 3/4 points. None of those sorts of things exist. There's no mutants, there's no fossils, there's no examples where there's interim species. And then if I talk about probability, and we'll talk about this again later in the session, but if I talk about probability, that's where it gets really tricky. And so I know my kids down here have just done probability at school, so they know all about probability. Jonah, if I flipped a coin, what's the probability of getting ahead? Yeah, 1 in 2. And if I did it again, 1 in 2 times 1 in 2, which is 1 in 4. And if I did it again, 1 in 8, because it's 2 times 2 times 2. So it gets tricky, and what it becomes is exponentially becomes a significant number, or in other words, an insignificant number, a number that is very, very, very unlikely. So let's not forget that evolution is a theory, even if people say they regard it as fact. It's poor science. On the other hand, if we believe that our life around us was created by God and is sustained by God, then we've got a clear answer. And what it tells us is that there was an intelligent designer who created that. It answers all the questions around how the cellular level, how the molecular level works. What it does, what scientists have even discovered is these DNA strands. Of course, we know about DNA, everyone knows about DNA these days, but DNA strands that give all the information and all the instructions about how those cells actually produce or reproduce, or how they should develop. Information that can tell them how to combat viruses or even repair themselves. So, Our understanding today around science is very incomplete. Scientists are obviously gathering more information and more understanding every day, but not even scientists, not even specialist scientists really understand how life works, or in their words, how it began. But what we do know is that the Bible tells us this. The Bible tells us clearly that God was the creator and that God was able to breathe into man the breath of life. So that's what it says in Genesis 2 verse 7. Then the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground. He breathed the breath of life into the man's nostrils, and the man became a living person. That's it. That's the beginning of life, where God created. And those Hebrew words are ruach hayim. It's the breath of life. It's God's spirit that started life. And it says man became a living person, or a living soul, a nephesh. It's the Hebrew word, it's a nephesh. It's not an immortal soul, but it's a living soul, a living being. Really important. So what does intelligent design really mean then in our thinking? Because what we're saying effectively is that living things have the marks of design in them. It's not just one thing happening and then by chance something else happens, as in you would do if you were measuring something or trying to get a physical characteristic of something. It's because multiple things are all happening at the same time and interacting with each other that it causes, that it makes this such a sensational story. And the reason we say that, not only from what we can read in the Bible, but we can sort of see that the range of variables, the range of conditions that life needs to happen to be sustainable has happened. So it happened in a moment, and it actually sort of meant that all those variables had to be in place for that life to be sustained. So it's intricate, it was self-repairing, it was deriving energy from its environment. That's what life means, to exist. So here's our first example where we are talking about a particular plant hopper. I'll just click through, sorry. Too far? This hopper is called an Isis coleoptractus, which I've never pronounced before in my life, but it's a plant hopper, and I'll refer to it as a plant hopper. It's easy. So this particular plant hopper has two back legs, of course, that it pushes off to jump. You know, there's nothing sort of amazing about that really, except that in this case there is. You might have remembered that Adam talked about the little pocket watch last week, where it's got little cogs and little wheels inside, like that little diagram up there. All those cogs are working, interacting to try and make that clock function. And it's got to do at least three different things, hasn't it? It's got to move hands, second hand, a minute hand, an hour hand. It's got to move at the right time. It's got to be able to keep track of time. So there's some engineering principles there around how many cogs are in that wheel, the size of the wheel, the diameter, all those kinds of things. But what we find in this plant hopper, something very similar. We find that in the back legs, they actually work in unison because of these little cogs that you can see up here. And this is an electron microscope that's actually sort of looked at this. So you can see these little teeth, like cogs in a cog wheel, that are actually interacting with each other. So the full force of those legs is equal to the other side. So that is an engineering principle that we know about obviously today, but God created that in this plant hopper so that it could actually not jump to one side with just one leg jumping, but they actually acted in unison. And the shape and the strength of those teeth, they needed to be sufficient to transfer that energy from where it was pushing through to its legs. Because you see, lots of animals have these amazing senses and precision mechanics to make them function. So when we can see a number of these specific things working together in unison, then we can clearly understand that there has to be some sort of principle behind that for that to have happened. It didn't just happen by chance that, oh, hang on, I grew a cog, and then over here I grew a muscle on my leg, and then suddenly that just started working. No, because it had to happen at the same time. So those living cells were able to grow, repair, and rebuild themselves at the time to allow that hopper to jump. So every cell of this hopper, or this isis, contains the required blueprint. It's got DNA to sort of know how that part of its body functions. There's lots of other animals that use different things as well. So when we think about radar and sonar and things like that, some of these animals have those things inbuilt to them. So turtles, monarch butterflies, even bacteria have sensors that they're able to understand their environment and be able to work through that. Evolution would say that it happened by chance. I suppose the question for you is did it happen by chance or not? Because if it did, then it would require millions and millions and millions of trial and error for that to work perfectly. So in other words, what I'm saying, it didn't happen by accident, that it was actually done by design, and it was done with a purpose for an intelligent reason. Let's move on to our second example this afternoon, and we're going to talk about the accidental brain. The brain is a really, really complex piece of tissue in our bodies. It has billions and hundreds of billions of neurons within our brain. And those motor neurons transmit information from our brain to our body to make it function, to work, muscles. It also creates our ability to make decisions. It also creates the ability for us to think and potentially be moral in our thinking. So it creates wisdom, something that other species don't have. It is in itself a really, really powerful supercomputer. And so those neurons are the most important component of our brain that allow us to transmit information throughout our bodies and also take in information from our bodies. It's able to make us think, to perform commands and take actions, and as I said, apply wisdom. So that is a snapshot using, it's an electron microscope, I believe, but they've actually taken about 5,000 slices through a piece of brain that is only about 1 millimetre by 1 millimetre by 1 millimetre, so it's 1 millimetre cubed, and actually sort of come up with trying to map the neurons of the brain. Probably a really fundamentally amazing thing in itself. But what you find there is that it's a network that is so intricate that it couldn't have happened by chance. So in that 1 millimetre cube of brain tissue, there are 150 million neuron connections. There's 57,000 cells and 23 centimetres of blood vessels, all working intricately into this amazing computer operating system, similar to what would be called something that had 100 billion microprocessors to actually make a supercomputer run is in that small piece of brain tissue. So that is an amazing thing from the brain. And as we know, it's not only our brain that makes us think, we have a lot of senses in our body. So we have eyes, we can see, we have ears, we can hear, we have taste, we can taste. What else do we have? Smell, I'm going to talk about smell. And we have touch, we can feel things. Smell is one of the only things that we can't accurately define. You can take a picture and see something. You can record a sound, but you can't do anything with a smell. You can't record it. You can't actually capture it. It's one of those senses, you can try and describe it by comparing it to other things. You can't actually sort of define the scope of smell and say, oh, I've got a 23.6 smell here. It doesn't work. But our senses, our brains are able to actually differentiate smell. I mean, we can sort of obviously say, oh, that's a bad smell or that's a good smell, but it's a range, it's a continuum, isn't it, of a whole range of different kinds of smells. So those sensors on the inside of our nose, if we haven't got a cold, those sensors on the inside of our nose are able to pick up minor perceptions and differences in smell. It's an amazing feature that isn't replicable by any sort of intelligence from man. But if we are going to start talking about artificial intelligence, because let's face it, there are some amazing things happening in artificial intelligence. There's no doubt about it that we're getting very close to where scientists are actually able to use computer artificial intelligence to make things that would take us some time to do. So, but what we find is that AI can only get to a certain point. In fact, it's probably hit that ceiling now where further artificial intelligence is not actually readily going to expand a heck of a lot further. The next design leap would involve a complexity that attempts to mimic the way that the human brain thinks. So it can actually take data, it can actually take things and rearrange that to form an answer, so it can think in some respects. Can't apply things like morals or anything like that, but it can think. But if it does sort of break through this next ceiling, then artificial intelligence could create intuition. So that's a bit of a step, but it could create intuition where it can predict things accurately. So there's this artificial intelligence called Centaur, which can predict and simulate human behaviour, but it can only be done to a certain level. So when researchers, and that only came out in the 2nd of July 2025, so this month, there was a paper that was written in respect to researchers' claims about AI being able to simulate the human mind. But there was a lot of pushback on that as well, and here's one of them. I think there's going to be a big portion of the scientific community that will view this paper very sceptically and be very harsh on it. So it's by no means something that is definite. Let's continue with artificial intelligence and think about, well, what's the differences? If we can actually recreate a human brain in artificial intelligence, what does that mean for us? And it is a bit scary. It makes me think, for sure. But something that the brain does that artificial intelligence doesn't is that artificial intelligence requires a huge amount of computing power, and that computing power generates a heck of a lot of heat and a heck of a lot of energy to drive it. So much so that these big complexes now need to have water cooling. They used to just be air cooled. Now they need water cooling, and it creates such a hot spot in terms of heat generation that it's and energy absorption that it's totally inconceivable, I suppose, when you compare that to a brain who can do the same thing, and it relies on a bit of food and water and oxygen to actually make it work, and it sits inside your head and it doesn't need to have all that additional energy and water cooling and everything else that happens. So a modern AI data center can generate enough heat to keep a city warm during a whole winter. So it's a huge energy suck, and that's actually probably one of the things that scientists are even battling with today is how are we ever going to generate enough energy to be able to drive these things? because none of those data centers were ever designed with that in mind. The brain then, it becomes an even greater, amazing organ that actually operates. And of course, as I'm telling you right now, it's not by chance, it's by design. And then we talk about ChatGPT. Everyone loves ChatGPT. It makes our lives so much easier, doesn't it? It can write things for us. It didn't write this presentation. I tried. No, I didn't. I just thought that it's worth thinking about what that does to us as humans, because as we use more things like ChatGPT, there's a great concern that it will dumb down what we are able to do, that it will we'll have a decline in how we can think critically and how we can actually apply those thoughts. So the argument is that if students use AI tools too early, that they won't then develop basic skills for critical thinking and problem solving. According to a recent study by scientists from MIT, using ChatGPT to help write essays can lead to cognitive debt and a likely decrease in learning skills. So there's a downside to things like AI, isn't there? If we get too accustomed and too used to using them, we'll actually in ourselves end up dumbing down what God has even provided for us. So the last slide on neural networks. So despite their vast appetites for energy and data, things like language is something that AI, large language models have a struggle with, even if the human brain and those models share a lot in common. And let's face it, they're both made up of millions of subcomponents, so biological neurons and simulated neurons in the case of AI. But you know what? Scientists barely understand how each of them work. So there's still a lot of unknowns about these networks. Let's move on to our third one, the pride of the peacock. So everyone's seen a peacock. Everyone knows what a peacock looks like. When it flicks, when they flick up their tails and they have those big feathers that come out to about 180 degrees, and they're really, really colourful. Lots of greens and blues and these little eyes that appear all over the feathers. Well, if we reflected and thought about Darwin's theory of life, then he would suggest that natural selection happens because an animal or a living being needs to survive. So it's actually over, his theory is that over millions of years things have progressed because the function of that particular animal needed this to survive. Well, we know it doesn't need it to survive. We know that those colours are produced, and I'll get into those details in a minute, are produced in a special way. And it's because those feathers know how to reproduce themselves. So every year when the feather gets shed, the DNA tells the peacock how to grow that particular feather. And they're all at different sizes and all at different shapes, so that they have really specific tolerances about how they can actually sort of grow and to what size to form those eyes on a mathematical arc, generation after generation, because of the detail that's in the DNA, the information that's in the DNA that tells that feather how to grow. What it does then is says that Darwin's theory of evolution is totally inadequate to explain why this peacock's tail has these little colours, the shapes and the arcs of those eyes as you sort of look across that 180 degrees, because there's a certain mathematical formula that you can look at as to how they even line up. So the different sizes of those feathers are all at a certain length to make that happen. So let's talk a little bit more about the feathers. We talked about the feathers being a complete semicircle. Each feather is grown independently from its own follicle. Each feather has a main stem and it's covered with these little barbules, little tiny ribbon-like threads where the colour comes from. And the colours of those eyes are iridescent. What does actually that mean? It means that if I look at a different angle, the colour changes. So there's some iridescence around those colours, and that's because the colour is not the result of a pigment in the feather, it's the result of how light bounces off the feather through these tiny little coatings of transparent protein called keratin. So each of these feathers have a little layer of keratin on them, and that's how the light, when you look at it from different angles, causes slightly different colours. So it's not something that the animal needed to survive from a threat, but it was certainly very attractive to its mate. Here's the last example. I'm going to power through, and then we can actually have some afternoon tea down the hall here. Let's talk about that old monkey business. The basis of the theory of evolution, that if there's enough time that passes, anything can happen. So I suppose there's a big question mark on that, because we know that things need to happen in sync, or things need to happen in a certain order for life to even exist. So if there was millions and millions of years to create these beings and these living organisms, how did they survive during that period where something they rely on was needed? So it's so complicated that we can't even imagine perhaps how a living cell could even have been created by accident. So when mathematicians talk about probability, back to probability, Matt, over here. That's your favourite topic, Jonah. You love it. When it gets to a chance of 1 in 10 to the power of 50, do you know what 1 in 10 to the power of 50 means? Anybody? Yes? It means it's 1 with 50 zeros. So imagine a number with 1 to 50 zeros after it. Once it gets past that, look, let's face it, it's pretty improbable, right? So most mathematicians would say it's effectively zero probability. It's never going to happen. So the likelihood of a single molecule of a protein hemoglobin assembling by itself by chance, according to Isaac Asimov, he said the odds against arranging the 20 amino acids involved in 4 chains each, 146 links long, is about 10 to the power of 170. So we've basically just tripled the length of that number now. It's 10 with 170 zeros after it. That's how small is the likelihood of evolution happening to create even just a protein. We choose to believe in God because we can read the Bible and we know that it is God's word that's been recorded in the Bible. So that's our choice. But you'll find that Darwin's theory of evolution was more or less created because people wanted an alternative to believing in God. That their materialistic culture meant that they could find another reason why there was design or no intelligence or there was a purpose. Because people like to think that it's easier if they don't have to believe in God. It takes away a lot of their responsibility if they feel that something happened by chance, then they don't actually have to acknowledge that God exists. And so there's this idea of, if I don't need to have that personal responsibility, then I don't need to do anything about it. And so people will be prepared to embrace these ultra fantastic kind of degrees of improbability and hang their hat on that rather than a simple process of just believing in a creator. This is what Albert Einstein said: there are only 2 ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle. And I think that in itself, if I even change the slide, you'd be able to see it, in itself is a huge insight to how a scientist like Albert Einstein thought. But this is what God says. Habakkuk 2 verse 14, "For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." And Hebrews 11 verse 1, this is what we need to do. We need to have faith. Now, faith is the substance or confidence of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So just because we can't necessarily see it or explain it, doesn't mean to say that God didn't make it. That's the end of my slides for the moment, but let's have a bit of a discussion. Let's have some questions if there are any, and take it from there.
It's quite easy to throw, years, millions of years or something, and say, yeah, it's come about billions of years. But what you're saying is something hasn't continued on because it hasn't had all the elements there for it to survive. It then can't pass on anything. It's not an ancestor of it because it's dead. So the next one comes along, it doesn't have that intelligence that the first one has learned, hey, I can't survive the realm because I don't have X, Y, and Z. It doesn't have any offspring to have the opportunity to continue on and learn and get the next protein or develop lungs so it really takes more faith to believe in a big number than it does that it's created.
But it's convenient, isn't it? Because I could just put that down to chance. Yep, lock that way, tick that box, close that vault, don't need to worry about it anymore. But you're right, you're spot on, because you would also then look at the evidence and say, well, hang on, where was that creature and that creature and that creature and that creature to even create, I don't know, whatever it is, a possum. So if there was millions or hundreds even of different interim species, you would expect to find that
in the fossils,
in the fossils or wherever.
Plus,
or even still existing.
exactly,
somehow.
Yeah. And not only do you need all of your systems to be working for life to survive with one human, like all your proteins and everything, all the other systems you've got, but you need two, because you need a man and a woman for life to continue on.
Yep, spot on.
So with the peacock, yes, people might say, well, it took millions of years to make it attractive, but it would have still been reproducing with its opposite to create more life. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It's not. It has to be there at the beginning or it doesn't survive.
Correct. All right, well, really appreciate everyone's time and for coming out this afternoon and listening in. What we might do is just close in a quick word of prayer through Brother Don, and then